State Board. And here in beautiful People's Island, where I'm going to tell you, you have less snow on the ground than Long Island. And a very pretty morning to be doing this. And we're still waiting for some people. And, so we're going to do a little moving around of the agenda, but we always start, of course, with the roll call. So, Kathy,
okay, so hi.
Here.
Aldridge, it will be a little late. Joanne Aroney not here. Randy Crawford.
Yeah.
Michael Devonshire is on his way. J.D. Lorenzo, not here yet. Doug Pirelli.
Here.
Paul Stewart.
Here.
Lucy Gillespie. Here. Kristen Herron also on the way. Jen Lamont. Here. Here. Ron Feaster.
Here.
And Chuck Vander.
Here.
Kristen and Michael are on their way from the train. Quinn's going to be a little late because his wife is being sworn into the federal bar, which he encouraged her to do, so he is obliged to watch. Okay, so that's done.
Okay. Well, I'd like to introduce two new members of the staff this morning. Emily Gould.
Emily, stand up.
Hi, Emily. Welcome. Emily is joining the National Register unit, where she will be taking over from Travis and his territory. She is a native of Troy and holds a BA in history from the University of Rochester, an MA from the Cooperstown program in folk life, an MS in technical communications from RPI, and a PhD from RPI in communications and rhetoric. And has worked at the John J. State Historic Site. Was involved in the original survey of Troy, on which we had based the Central Troy District. She has taken her new territory on with a vengeance and plunging into the history of Lewis County as if her life depended on it. Cass writes, we are delighted to have you on board. Welcome. Also joining our staff is Paul Archambault and Paul. Good morning. Paul joined the survey and CLG unit as manager of the upcoming large-scale historic resources survey of communities in New York City and Long Island that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and they're still being impacted. You saw that 60-minute segment recently. And of course, support for this project has been received from the National Park Service as part of the Hurricane Sandy disaster relief. Paul was director of the Waterford Historical Museum and Cultural Center, and brings his enthusiasm and skills in grants management, community preservation planning, survey and National Register. He's also a volunteer with the Mohawk Valley Collective, providing expertise in land bank, to land bank authorities. And he has a master's degree in public history from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Welcome aboard as well, Paul.
Thank you.
And I just want to introduce Justin Countryman. Justin, will you take a little bow up there? Justin is our new administrative professional for the National Register and Survey units. So he's been helping getting our nominations out, our Part 1s, and he's proved himself invaluable in a short amount of time. So I just wanted to recognize him. He's a terrific asset to our unit. And he's observing now what it's all about, what he's been doing all this for. So we have two corrections to the minutes. We have to approve the minutes, right? Well, we have two corrections, and one is from Kristen, and she's not here. So do you want me to read it, or should we wait for her?
Do you have it?
I do. She thought she talked about amphitheater. She had abstained on the vote rather than voted no.
Okay.
Because she wasn't at liberty to vote yes or no on sending a letter because she was the proxy. So she wants the minutes corrected to reflect that. And in terms of Crown Point, and I don't remember what the J isn't here either, but she said that the notes say she indicated that the Preservation League supported this project with a Preserve New York grant, and she thought what she actually said was that the league administers Preserve New York in partnership with NISCA. She was trying to make the point that Preserve New York grants are NISCA grants that are very ably administered by the league. So,
That sounds right from my understanding. Yeah.
did you have a correction, Doug, or no?
No.
Okay, I thought somebody else had one. So I guess we insert, not sure, I'll have to check, we insert some kind of a note on the minutes that they've been corrected. Does anybody else have any corrections?
Okay, if not, if we could have a motion to accept with revisions to be made as detailed by Kat. And
Second.
Randy moves it, and Lucy seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Now,
I'll go to over the calendar.
sure, the calendar.
So, does everybody have that the next meeting is June 11th here? The meeting after that is September 17th, possibly non-year, and that the final meeting for the year is December 3rd. Is that all right with everybody? Kristen, we just announced your correction. Oh, thank you. And everyone approved it, so we're done with that. How about the minute? How about the next meeting? Everybody got that? I also just want to mention that we have guests coming from 4 properties today: the Unitarian Church in Buffalo, the Wackabuck Historic District, the Hedge House, and the Conkling Boardman Eldridge Farm. And we also do or do not have visitors from John Bonafini's class, may or may not have visitors from John Bonafini's class, and he will introduce them when they came. Apparently some came yesterday. Anything else, Bob?
Well, we're not going to see, unfortunately, a commissioner or deputy commissioner today, but we will have our own commissioner, Ruth Pierpont, who is on a conference call, I think, with the commissioner this time, and she's going to be giving us a report on what's happening in Washington in particular, and so we look forward to that. I think what we could do, then, Kat, is move right to John's report. Chris, and John, it's all yours.
Good morning. This is actually just a brief update from what we showed you with our last meeting, your last meeting, late November. Was it November or December? It's all blurred now. Last meeting, the awards, we gave you kind of an overview of where Chris was. We had done a preliminary launch of the system. It was kind of working internally. It hadn't really been put out to the general public yet at that point. Since that time, we've had the official release, which was a governor's press statement. We've been moving on and getting the system officially up and running and out into the public domain. I'm just going to only got a couple of slides to walk through. Just to give you a sense, one of the things we can do now with the new system is do Google Analytics. And Mike Schifferle has been great about keeping track of where people are touching the system. As you can see, we've gone global with Chris, with pretty much one person touching it in every light color country you see. But they touched it. So I think somebody said maybe it was just a spam attack. Nevertheless, it's a really impressive slide, so I'm putting it up there just to...
Watch those Russians.
Yeah, I like very statewide, just gives you a sense of distribution of use. Statewide, obviously, the urban areas are hitting the system a little harder than most of the rural areas. But you can see we're getting a nice distribution of use across the state at this point. We've had 150 archaeologists sign up and receive full privilege to the system. We have 890 external authenticated users, and that doesn't include our staff. Altogether, there's about 1,000 people that have passwords into the system since January 22nd. So about 2 months of counting here. We've had just under 14,000 sessions, or people hit the system and do work in it during that same period. And all told, over 5,000 users from 46 states and 23 countries, including one guy from Liberia. We've done training, and specifically Mike Schifferle and Matt Shepard and the staff have done training sessions with FEMA, Army Corps of Engineers, Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, DEC, Parks, DOT, and Federal Highway. These are kind of ongoing training sessions. They've either been done in person, or we've just launched a series of webinar trainings. We had the New York City Corps, or FEMA yesterday. We're doing OPRHP's staff here, a large number of their planning staff, because we're going to integrate this program into the larger OPRHP planning and program management. That'll be early or mid next month. We've already done DOT and FEMA training. So these trainings are getting more and more people into the system. We're beginning to slowly kind of acclimate people to use the system. The feedback so far hasn't been bad. I won't say it hasn't been great, because there hasn't been a lot of positive feedback, but no feedback we take as positive feedback. So most of the issues have been with agencies trying to see how it's going to fit into their workflow and structure. So it really isn't an issue with our system. It's how they're going to be adapting their programs to make better use of this system. Has anyone from the board tried it out yet? Chuck's been down. Maybe more is down. Chuck's in it deep. We won't ask Chuck if he likes it or not.
I'll give it my list later.
John, are you going to go to the municipal historians?
We've met with them the past 2 years. We'll meet with them probably again. They're actually a really good group to meet with. They're very excited about the system. We've been encouraging them, once the system comes online, to get a login and begin updating their surveys. And begin putting new survey data, because that gives us 1,600 new eyes and ears that have some knowledge about their communities, updating data for us and building our survey, which is really an important goal of the program.
The Preservation League's colleagues program, will they meet?
We met with the colleagues 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, and gave them a presentation and had tremendous feedback, and we're talking with Jay about doing a webinar for their colleagues network to get
And
them better
actually,
training.
Daniel was glowing and talking about it afterwards, how much it helped him.
A staff person from
Daniel McKay from the league was raving about it afterwards.
So it's been going well. I will also mention that last week the staff working on this was honored with a agency award. Mike Schifferle, we have coming, Amy Faca, Travmo, and Kathy Howe, and Matt Shepard, the commissioner, as part of the Huddleston Awards, which were annual awards for park staff, gave the group a special award for the project development and completion, which we placed over here for your viewing. You can actually touch it. That's everything I've got. Thanks.
Thank you.
And if anyone ever wants to get into the system or has questions, you can reach out to me or Matt or Mike directly, and they'll be glad to walk you through getting on.
And now we've got an interesting report that Cass and Jennifer put together, looking at urban renewal in our resources.
So at our last meeting, we noticed, well, a certain lack of enthusiasm for a property that represented the theme of urban renewal. But since the earliest urban renewal legislation is now more than 50 years old, and we've already been making eligibility determinations for urban renewal properties through the compliance process, it is very likely that we will be asked to consider an urban renewal property for nomination in the future. So we thought we'd take this opportunity, when there's no specific property up for nomination, to explore the topic a little bit with you. So I'm going to provide some history and background, and then Jennifer is going to show you some examples, both in other states and in New York, and then she's going to suggest some points that we might consider in evaluating them. Now, I just want to say this is going to be a very broad brush. There's a lot to say on the topic. We consider this a conversation starter, and if you want to come back to it at any point, makes you think, and you want to discuss it again in the future, we'll be happy to do that. And I also personally want to thank Jen, and you should too, because she puts an awful lot of time and effort into this, and we spent a lot of time talking about it. She also fixed all my text boxes, because I stink at text boxes. And no, she really did an excellent job on this, so I just want to thank her for that. So, urban renewal, perhaps one of the most maligned initiatives in the history of urban planning. In some cases, the reputation is justified. We can all think of some building lost, some group hurt, some city damaged by urban renewal. Those failures have been acknowledged by architecture, planning, and preservation communities. And almost everyone considers urban renewal a lesson in what not to do. So why on earth would we want to consider preserving this legacy? Well, first, I think it's important to remember that nobody set out to destroy our cities. Urban renewal was a sincere effort to solve a set of real problems. The idea of renewing the city center was meant to civilize rebirth, and some cities were clearly threatened. But did some of the plans overreach? Well, we know that cities have been remade on a grand scale for centuries, sometimes with spectacular results. Hauser redesigned Paris in the 1850s, Burnham proposed a radical new plan for Chicago in the 1890s, and Bennett suggested a blueprint for Buffalo in 1922. This one was not effective. And many of the urban spaces that we treasure were attained only at the losses of other spaces that we also treasure, or might have treasured had they survived. This block of West 50th Street was demolished to construct Rockefeller Center. Likewise, there are also spaces created by urban renewal that we've all come to value. Admittedly, it's a complicated and complex topic, but I hope that we can at least try to approach it with an open mind and to understand and appreciate its objectives and to recognize its role in American planning history, so that when we are called upon to evaluate it, we can make informed decisions. So urban renewal has two slightly different roots. The first is the need for urban housing reform, sparked by industrialization and immigration. In the late 19th century, reformers called attention to overcrowded and unhealthy urban slums. In New York City, their efforts led to model tenement laws and architectural experiments. However, although 10 groups of model tenements were built in the city between 1855 and 1905, they were greatly outnumbered by the more than 50,000 old-style tenements built in the same period. By the late 1920s, a survey indicated that only 38% of housing in the U.S. was in good condition, while much was substandard or outdated, still using wood or coal-burning stoves and lacking indoor plumbing. The Depression only made things worse, as housing construction fell by 95% and more than 270,000 homeowners lost their homes. But despite the demonstrated need, prior to the 1930s, few housing reformers ever considered the possibility that the government would play a role in building or subsidizing housing. There was New Deal housing, Greenbelt being one of the most noted and successful examples, and some important legislation, such as the Housing Act of 1937, which established a clear federal commitment to providing decent housing for the American poor. During World War II, the government constructed more than 625,000 units of housing for war workers, and some of this became low-income housing after the war. At the same time, other concerns about the city center were raised by those with business and civic interests, real estate owners, business owners, and politicians, who were alarmed at what they saw as declining downtowns. They saw wealthy folks leaving the city for the suburbs, deteriorated housing, the erosion of small-scale businesses, and a decrease in commercial property values that discouraged investment. In the early 1940s, one group put together a list of more than 200 cities that were endangered by decentralization and warned that they would face financial ruin. They saw the drab appearance of center cities and called it blight, and they saw a simple solution: remove the blight, remove the problems. Many in this group believed that intervention on a grand scale was needed. They advocated comprehensive planning to restore the core components of the city: offices, hotels, government centers, and theaters. But not all supported government intervention. Some wanted cities to acquire property through eminent domain and sell it to private developers at low prices. These two groups were basically at odds. But at the end of World War II, the government was compelled to address the urban housing problem first, because of the profound housing crisis triggered by millions of returning veterans, many of them starting new families. And there was simply not enough available housing in the city to accommodate them. In 1949, 1.8 million Chicago families needed housing, but there were only a total of 906,000 standard units in the city. This flood of new families with urgent needs, combined with the massive amounts of federal money going into highways, almost forced the decentralization and destabilization of cities. The middle class, the white married middle class that is, followed the wealthy to the suburbs, leaving behind people who were more marginalized, poorer, and less able to invest in their neighborhoods and their downtowns. This left city centers even more precarious. America was not alone in struggling with these issues, and the continent's urban core experienced many of the same problems. But the European approach was somewhat different. European architects embraced the 20th century as a new age. Visionary architects believed that they could use new materials and technologies to provide a healthier environment for living, working, and doing business. And they worked to show how architecture could be used to improve the lives of everyday people. Architects such as Le Corbusier were inspired to design buildings and communities with unprecedented amounts of light, open space, and ventilation. During the first half of the 20th century, modern architects across Europe designed experimental apartment buildings, garden apartments, row housing, and planned residential communities using the latest materials and technology, as well as the avant-garde style that they felt best expressed the spirit of the age. European modernism was envisioned as an architectural and planning solution to social problems. However, when it was imported to America, not all of those social concerns arrived with it. Instead, in the US, modern architecture became the face of corporate America, and its application to public housing often fell short of the ideal. Indeed, when the style was copied for public housing, American planners sometimes skimmed on the amenities that the European architects were so careful to integrate, features that humanized and dignified the spaces they created. The failure to provide funds for maintenance and upkeep also doomed many modern housing projects to an untimely death that was not always the fault of the buildings. So all these themes came together at the end of World War II. Both the housing reformers and the city planning group wanted change, and with the legacy of the New Deal, both now look to the federal government for assistance. The housing crisis meant that legislation would focus on that first, but some provisions of the housing laws left room for other renewal options. Architects looked to modern architecture, but didn't always capture its spirit. So there was probably no way that all these expectations could be met and that this could all end well. So there are 5 basic legislative initiatives that shaped urban renewal. First was the Housing Act of 1949. Though it didn't use that name, this law is recognized as the beginning of the urban renewal era and is the first comprehensive housing act ever passed in the United States. This established a national goal of a decent home for every American family. It recognized slums as a national problem. It provided federal funds for local slum clearance, and it set aside federal funds to build 800,000 public housing units. This law provided money, but it placed the responsibility for development in local hands that didn't always have the expertise to use it. It provided money for slum clearance and replacement, but it didn't mandate that residences be replaced with residences. Sometimes commercial or other development was built. It didn't require that new homes be constructed in the city or that they be for low-income residents. It did not actually increase the amount of housing, it just replaced what was there. This law did not achieve its goals. Of the 800,000 proposed units, only 84,600 were under construction in 1951. What looked like a large investment never came close to what was being spent on highways, airports, water, or sanitation. And between 1934 and 1954, only 7% of substandard housing was eliminated. Next was the Housing Act of 1954. This law gave us the name, urban renewal, and it provided 140,000 units of public housing with preferential treatment for families that had been relocated by slum clearance. FHA mortgage assistance was also extended to private developers who were building housing that met the urban renewal goals. But one of the most important provisions was that the 1944 requirement that projects be predominantly residential was reduced. Now, 10% of federal grants could support non-residential projects, which substantially enlarged allowable project types. This law also had problems. Its programs were costly and complicated to initiate. The interest by private developers never materialized. Code enforcement was not strengthened, as its proponents had hoped, and despite encouragement to do comprehensive planning, most cities operated on a project-by-project basis. In the next few years, an increasing percentage of urban renewal projects were allowed to be non-residential. The 10% exemption in the 1954 Act was raised to 20% by 1959, 30% in 1961, and 35% in 1965. Unfortunately, cities, led by those advocating more comprehensive approach, took this as an endorsement to demolish thousands of homes and construct highways, civic centers, and other large-scale projects. Cities experimented with everything from downtown government centers to sprawling industrial parks. Some of the grandest and most optimistic schemes were proposed in this period, perhaps too optimistic, and while some were completed, many were not, sometimes leaving empty land that had been cleared but was never redeveloped. As a result, in the period between 1958 and 1963, urban renewal was substantially more destructive to American cities than had ever been intended or foreseen by sponsors of the 1949 law. The next act was the Highway Act of 1956, which gave the state and federal government complete control of highways in and around cities. The result was that new highways were often routed directly through vibrant historic neighborhoods, many of which were destroyed or isolated. And this is about the time that we began to hear complaints about the justice of urban renewal projects that involved demolition and displacement of low and moderate income neighborhoods. In 1965, we had the establishment of HUD and several laws associated with it. This greatly expanded funding for existing federal housing programs, and it added new ones. And the most important was probably the Model Cities Act of 1966. This was the first significant acknowledgement of the need for integrated planning. Its goal was the coordinated social and economic rehab of blighted areas. Grants of up to 80% were available for creating and administering an integrated program of social services that would require citizen participation. The Model Cities program was especially significant because it mandated code enforcement, which proved a vital tool for stabilizing the neighborhoods. Lastly, the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 marked the end of the urban renewal period.
Street and Lawrence Street. Masonry reconstruction in the commercial district rapidly expanded through the 1880s thanks to the wealth accrued by Olean's successful oil industry along the Allegheny River. As the city grew, its buildings became larger and more ornate, designed to stand out amongst their neighbors, and many were designed by well-known architects. While the last contributing building was constructed in 1915, many of the commercial buildings received notable facade updates in the 1930s, installing structural glass tiles and new signage, marking the end of the period of significance. This is sort of the last gasp to try to retain commercial downtown shopping. The historic district contains several intact storefronts with wood interior display cases intact as well as those modernized in the 1930s. So while the district continues to serve as the city's commercial center, Olean's dominance in the region diminished once the oil industry closed and development patterns moved away from downtown. Although an intact collection of original buildings remains within the historic district, many downtown storefronts are now vacant. However, the economic downturn in Olean has worked in the architecture's favor in that little money was spent to renovate the commercial district facades in the early 20th century, maintaining the district's integrity. The Historic District project has created great interest in the tax credit programs as a tool to help rebuild and revitalize Olean. So this project has received 8 letters of support, including those from the mayor, State Assembly member Joseph Giglio, State Senator Catherine Young, and several owners. So this is the Union and State Street Historic District.
Jay moves it, and Kristen seconds, all in favor? Aye.
Thank you.
Good morning. I have 4 proposals for you this morning. As luck would have it, 2 of them relate to the history of the Palatine Germans in New York State, just sort of how it worked out. We're going to start with the Coons Farm, but by way of context, we know the Palatines, that's sort of a rough road to get to where they got ultimately from the war-ravaged Palatinate to what was in essence 18th century Hoovertown in London, to 2 work camps in the Hudson Valley, then onward to the Mohawk and Schoharie Valleys, where of course they encountered yet more warfare. The 2 houses we're going to look at today, fortunately, sort of post-date that not so great history. Charles H. Coons Farm in Germantown, built circa 1880 for Charles H. Coons, significant in the areas of architecture and agriculture. Really a nice sort of late example of a picturesque Italian farmhouse. Jennifer and Betsworth and I visited maybe about a year or 2 ago, and in looking at the building in the basement, it was pretty clear they had incorporated, in essence, components of the earlier house when they built this. Also on site, we should look at a couple interiors here. Period staircase, some reused federal material upstairs, but evidence of an earlier period when this farm was owned by the Lasher family, who were also Palatines. Early 19th century New World Dutch barn, and also a later horse and carriage barn, and probably agricultural storage. What we were able to learn about Charles Coons is he was really in many ways a pillar of Germantown at that time, engaged with Christ Lutheran Church in politics, and really described as one of the most extensive fruit growers, not only in Germantown, but in all of New York State. So representative of really the Palatines, when they came here, what they were experienced in was actually viticulture. So later in the 19th century, they returned this agriculture, which was more familiar to them. So that is Charles H. Coons' house.
Could you take a wild guess at how many New World Dutch barns survive in New York City?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, they continue to be found. I know one was recently found in Warren County, where you might not expect it. One was identified in St. Lawrence County. It's a question for the Dutch Farm Preservation Society. I will look into it if you want.
I guess I will move it. Who would second it?
I just have one question. Is the historical acreage of this farm from the 19th century in the nomination?
No, it's greatly reduced, and the reason that agriculture is checked is really because we're citing Charles Coons' significance, and he is significant really, principally as a fruit grower. But yeah, a lot of these, like another one we did earlier, have lost a lot of that acreage. So I'm not sure how the Park Service is going to think about it, but the reason agriculture was cited was really because of his significance within that context. But yeah, much smaller acreage. I think it was up to 225 acres, about 1900, 1910 or so.
I forget who was seconding Chuck, I guess. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Now, moving into the Mohawk and Schoharie Valleys, obviously the Naval Stores Project, as it was known, was really unsuccessful, and a large migration occurred shortly after the 1710 initial arrival in East Camp. And a number of families moved into the Schoharie Valley, including the Hess family. So what we have here is the Christian Hess house, and also a small shoemaker shop directly across. These are the historic resources which are associated with this property. You know, really, when you look at accounts of what happened in the Schoharie Valley in October 1780, you know, in essence, Governor Clinton himself said, you know, the Schoharie Valley is burnt and laid waste. We feel very few buildings survived from that, from before that period. I don't know that we have definitive evidence of that. We have one known as the Schaefer House, which was later turned into, in essence, a carriage barn. But our feeling about this house is that it's probably built immediately after the Revolution, and it really reflects a very standard type which we associate with the Palatine Germans, a story-and-a-half house divided into 2 rooms, in this instance also with a basement kitchen, which oddly enough, given where you are and the climate, was not accessible from the first story, which we think of sometimes as being a slave arrangement. In essence, you would go outside of this building to get to the primary space. We've seen this before in other houses in the Hudson Valley. So we have the house itself, probably built for the Weaver family immediately after the war, as well as the shoe shop. What it has really is 2 of the things I think would be the principal character-defining features of this house type. It's got the New World Dutch frame, and it's got the 2-room plan, you know, along with the basement. I want to introduce now Charlie. Where are you? Charlie Peace, who is the owner, and has been the owner, and really has spent how many decades now reversing reversing some of what happened there. And actually, Charlie, I'd love you to say a few words. Like, I know how important this is for you. I won't put you on the spot, but if you have anything you'd like to add.
No, I just appreciate all your efforts. The details, amazing. It was interesting this morning as I left the house. I put my hand on one of the hand plane beams and thought how pleased that person who had done that would have known that if this was going on 200 years later. So thank you very much.
Great. So being nominated in the areas of architecture and commerce for the small shoemaker shop and the associated trade, which Christian Hess, who died, strangely enough, on his way back, I think we have decided, from Cuba. At first we said he died on his way back from Cuba, and we thought Allegheny County. The more we looked at it, it looked like, no, he traveled probably on a leather procuring mission and never returned to Schoharie. Hess house.
Okay, Jay moves it and Kristen seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, moving back down into the Hudson Valley, into Ulster County, the Alligerville Historic District in the town of Rochester in the Rondout Valley. It's being nominated, in essence, for its association with the Delaware and Hudson Canal era. Really a very interesting resource, research and documentation compiled by Neil Larson of Larson Fisher Associates, significant in the areas of architecture, commerce, community planning and development, transportation and engineering. Alligerville and really that surrounding area was very much sort of a sleepy pastoral farm area before the D&H came through and bisected it and really transformed the landscape, the local economy, and local life there. What we're looking at is a picture that we believe is of George Harnden's boatyard, Harnden being one of the major players in Alligerville and its development. The name itself is probably, well, we know it's for the Alliger family, probably for Elijah Alliger, who along with the Schoonmakers and the Van Wagenens were really some of the earlier families that resided there. So what we have, in essence, is a collection of architecture and buildings, principally domestic, that grew up in association with Lock 21 of the D&H Canal. It really gave this place a reason for being. The house on the right was built by George Harnden, or for George Harnden, and his wife Catherine, probably about 1860. Harnden was English born. He was a boatwright. He came to the United States with his father-in-law, George Hoare, who set up a boat building business in Ellenville. And the one on the left is his son Joseph Harnden's house, built just a few years afterwards. A lot of the infrastructure, the canal infrastructure, has fallen away. Obviously, the boatyard, some of those other features are gone. Some of the roebling features do survive in part. But a few other resources on the top: Forbes Hotel, 2 views of it. I think a Van Wagenen house on the bottom right. And a few later buildings as well. I think the 2 bottom ones are Schoonmaker houses. What happens is the canal is slowly dying off as the 19th century progresses. The railroad has taken over that role of transporting coal from Pennsylvania to the big urban markets. and slowly the focus of people's lives there changes really to tourism principally, and a growing tourism trade. So representative resources, including bottom right, that's the Reformed Church, the Clove. I spent some time down there, multiple visits with Neil Larson and with Ward Mintz, and think, yeah, it's pretty remarkable little survival. You know, some of it's fallen away, but still really enough to portray its significance. And that is the Gallagherville Historic District.
Wint moves it, and we have Michael seconds, so all in favor?
Aye.
And finally, one more historic district in Saranac Lake, like the village itself, straddling two counties. The Helen Hill Historic District being nominated in the areas of architecture, health, medicine, and community planning and development, and in association with a very long-standing multiple property document for cure industry resources, basically tuberculosis-related cure industry resources in Saranac Lake. Helen Hill was prior to about 1898, 20-acre sheep pasture southeast of the core of Saranac Lake, which in that period was really evolving from sort of a provincial lumbering and tourist area into a major center for tuberculosis treatment because of the efforts of Edward Livingston Trudeau. About 1898, development begins here. Frederick Isham, very prominent figure in the development of Saranac Lake, purchases, consolidates the property for development. Picture on the top. You can see how quickly it builds up very rapidly in about a 30-year span. Now, a lot of the resources here do relate, in fact, as the documentation shows, to the tuberculosis industry. Bottom left, Mary Prescott Receiving Hospital was built to receive patients who were too ill to go directly into Trudeau's sanatorium, and I believe it was built at her own expense, built and operated. A few characteristic street views on the left on, I think, Franklin, Shepherd, and Helen Streets. A few individual properties. Note the Craftsman, which I think that might be Marvin Cottage, which might have already been listed. Six previously listed resources in the district. Note the Cure porch on the top. Probably the most grand building in the district, colonial revival building on Franklin. And then sort of representative, and you see the Noyes Cottage in the upper left, you see probably, and you won't see more Cure porches on one house than that. So really the character-defining feature of this property type, which is built in any number of styles and ways, of course, is the Cure porch. The Arch was responsible for the documentation, really did a good job combing through the records and building definitive evidence for how these buildings related to that larger industry. That is the Helen Hill Historic District.
Doug moves it, and we need a second. Wint seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
I just want to point out, in case nobody noticed, that we're doing 8 historic districts today, and I'm pretty excited about that. So, yay us. All those tax credits.
Shift down to Brooklyn. So this is the Manhattan Beach Jewish Center. Designed by Brooklyn architect Jacob Sherman, the Manhattan Beach Jewish Center was constructed between 1952 and 1962. The synagogue is the 1952 portion to the left, and the community house is to the right. The building dates from a period when Brooklyn had emerged as one of the world's major Jewish population centers, combining facilities for both synagogue and general community needs, including classrooms, meeting rooms, ballroom, gymnasium, and swimming pool. This is the product of the Jewish Center movement. The design by Sherman reflects developments in the Bauhaus-influenced European synagogues of the 1930s, and by the time of this synagogue's construction, modernism had become dominant in American synagogue design. The synagogue sanctuary is notable for its use of a crystalline tile produced by the Guastavino Company, which lines the walls, and the brightly colored abstract mosaic designs of the proscenium arch and on the window surrounds. Other interiors demonstrate a change from post-war neoclassical taste to a more mid-century modern style. Unfortunately, in October 2012, the surge of Superstorm Sandy submerged much of Manhattan Beach and inundated the synagogue and community center, flooding the ground floor with more than 5 feet of seawater. Demolition and abatement were largely completed in December of 2012, and the congregation was able to open the sanctuary for worship and the community house for school and senior services. However, a significant amount of work still needs to be accomplished here. They're working with Ann Friedman from the Sacred Sites Program to work on repairing the damage that was caused from the storm.
And they're eligible now.
And they are now eligible for the second round of Hurricane Sandy grant money. Any questions? This was prepared by Tony Robbins, too, who always brings in really terrific nominations.
He really does. And Michael moves it, and Kristen seconds. All in favor? Aye.
All right, it's a very cool property in the Bronx, in Williamsbridge. This is a city park. This is once a 41-foot deep reservoir. It's now a 19-acre public park engineered and constructed in 1937 under the WPA. The park is significant under criteria A in the area of community planning and development and is an example of a WPA-funded project that was part of the rapid expansion of New York City's park system under the leadership of Parks Commissioner Robert Moses. The focal point of the park is this Art Modern Style Recreation Center, which was designed by Chief Architect Amar Embry. The architect played a significant role in reshaping the New York City parks as either the chief or consulting architect on numerous park projects. It's estimated that he may have completed as many as 600 projects, including the Central Park Zoo, the Prospect Park Zoo, the New York City building at the 1939 World's Fair. The site is also significant under criteria C in the area of landscape architecture for its intact Beaux-Arts inspired landscape, a radial plan that is credited to Embry and several civil and landscape engineers, while elements of the reservoir survive in the form of some berms, a granite tunnel, and various stone walls. The site is more interpretable as a WPA-era city park. Thus, the period of significance has been established at the park's 1937 date of construction. Adjacent to this and across the road, listed several years by Kathy Howe, is the Keeper's House. So we kind of determined that was a better site to look at the reservoir aspect of the building. And adjacent to this is the Bronx County Historical Society, which was later integrated into the park as sort of a bump out. So today we're just looking at the reservoir, and simultaneously doing research to this, I was working on a project in Albany for Bleecker Stadium and discovered that too, which is coming in for NR as a former reservoir funded by the WPA for this type of conversion.
It's fascinating. I didn't know about this Amar Embry project. This guy is everywhere. I mean, he's working for Moses. He's the champion of small house design. He's writing for a number of architectural magazines. He's designing the Hofstra's first campus. I mean, he's doing country houses.
Mm-hmm.
He's just an amazing talent.
Yep, and landscape designer.
And landscape designer, yeah, incredible.
A very creative reuse of the reservoir.
I will move it, and Ron seconds. All in favor? Aye.
Good morning again. I'm kind of interloping into the NR program. For a few of you who come from the old days, I spent the first 15 years of my career working for Kath and then Mark doing National Registry nominations, and continue to kind of hold to myself my own community, which occasionally I'll bring a nomination forward and write them for the folks down there and try to help out a little bit. So I'm back to present today, and just not to sway your votes or anything, but this will actually be my 499th and 500th presentation before this august body. Don't feel any pressure. Don't treat that any differently. I'll also point out Bill's presentation on Helen Hill. I had to work on the MRA up there with Mary Hotel. Some of you again from the board from years ago remember Mary, who was just a steadfast supporter of the architecture and history of Saranac Lake, and really did a tremendous amount of work to bring that before this board. For you today, the two presentations. The first is the former parsonage of the Dutch Reformed Church of Queens. I tend to do very brief presentations, hopefully you've read the nominations. It's a great local example of free classicism, or that transitional period between Queen Anne and colonial revival remains remarkably intact from its construction period, 1892. Just a wonderful building. It was within the ownership of the church until 1978, when it was sold out when they lost their resident pastor, and has remained in private hands since then. And just some representative views of the interior. We've got very little change, nice early 20th century image from a local catalog at the bottom, just demonstrating the integrity that survives with the building. Can I answer any questions about this nomination?
Does the associated church survive and function?
It survives 2 doors down. It actually closed a spectacular Greek revival building. It was the second church built by the congregation in 1833. Remained virtually intact. Its organ, its bell, pulpit, furniture, hymnals all survived. The congregation sold the building probably about 2006, and it's been converted to a daycare. I'm not sure what the interior condition is. I know a lot of the elements did leave the church as part of renovations. It's about 2 doors down. There is a group working out to try to create a district down there. There's about 8 or 9 individual nominations in the hamlet, and hopefully we'll be able to knit these all together. At that point, the church would be included in it.
Okay, if there are no further questions, Jay moves it.
Yep.
And we need a second. Okay, Doug seconds, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, this is the important, so you gotta, don't burst the bubble now. So this is the Brigadier General David McCarty Stone House in Queens, kind of an odd little stone cottage, and a building tradition of this part of the country that generally is more Dutch. Again, if you read the nomination, McCarty, having lived there my whole life, I knew the house, didn't know his story until the local owners started asking to get designation for the house. The guy led a pretty remarkable life from his upbringing in France with Nick McCarty, coming to the colony through Canada, marrying into the Queens family, acquiring 10,000 acres of land in Queens, and will become Albany Green County. Member of the Committee of Correspondence for Albany County, one of the last judges appointed by the Crown, and then sitting on the Committee of Correspondence, being arrested as a Tory spy, and then being exonerated, going on to become a Brigadier General for the militia after the war, serving as one of the first judges named, helping to decide the race between George Clinton and John Jay for the second governorship of New York. Pretty remarkable life, I think, under criterion B. He really becomes a poster child, and then, typical of America, reaches the peak and then kind of loses it all in the end. A great American story. The cottage survives. It's been through a lot of change. It was a small house. I would say suffered. It went through what any house of 250 years in a small community would go through as family and tastes and needs changed. There's still a lot of research to do on this building. I think it certainly is probably not in the Dutch tradition of either Queens or Southern Albany County or Northern Greene County. I think it lends itself more to where he may have grown up, which is northwestern, the French area, the lowlands, kind of giving way to that building tradition, and certainly more research, and it's something I think we'll continue researching on. Interestingly enough, another piece that's missing on this nomination that I'm still trying to track down is there was a survey map by John Randall. And for those of you who know New York City history, John Randall was the surveyor who laid out the New York City grid system at great peril over 10 years at the turn of the 19th century. Prior to doing that job, he surveyed the hamlet when Queens patent was broken up for sale, and laid out the McCarty lots as part of that. That map is gone. I'm going to talk to my friend Ron about the Department of State's map collection and see if maybe it shows up there. But certainly a project that requires more research but I think sufficient information is known about Old McCarty and the fact that it's a 250-year-old pre-revolutionary cottage that survives in any community. I think meets the basic requirements of the registry. Any questions?
John, I think you owe it to history to decipher that mysterious inscription.
I'll tell you, Paul Huey could not figure it out. Paul can't figure it out. We turned it upside down. I think somebody was just messing with us.
Whit moves it, and Jay seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Get to present 3 more of these historic districts that are being considered today. The first nomination that I have to present is from the Finger Lakes and is in the city of Elmira in Chemung County. It's the Clinton-Columbia Historic District, and this nomination is sponsored by the Near West Side Historic Association in Elmira, who several years ago sponsored the nomination of the Near West Side Historic District. The map shows the Clinton-Columbia District circled in red, and the listed Near West Side District just below it. Although on this map they look like they touch, they are not contiguous, but they're very close. And the nominated district contains 5 sets of row houses, 3 at its edges and 2 in its center, which is something not found in the listed district to the south. The Clinton-Columbia Historic District is being nominated for its collection of 19th century and turn of the 20th century architecture, which puts that under criterion C. And here we see 2 of the row houses in the Lorenzo Weber House, which sits across from the row house pictured in the upper right. What we're seeing in this slide is the south side of West Clinton Street between College and Davis Streets. The district is also being nominated for community planning and developed under Criterion A. The area originally began slowly developing as residential housing in the 1850s, but the arrival and growth of the railroad industry greatly accelerated its development as the city's needs for housing increased. West Clinton Street contains most of the buildings in the district, and it shows a juxtaposition of modest versions of popular period architecture on the south side and higher style buildings on the north side. The extant architecture indicates that the neighborhood was a gathering place for people of various socioeconomic standing, which was supported by the period census records. This is the south side of the street, and this is the north side of the street. And we're looking from College Street to slightly past Davis Street. One of the residents of the street was architect Joseph Pierce, whose house is shown in the lower left. As stated in the nomination, this side of the street has deeper setbacks, larger lawns, more mature trees, which gives it more of a pleasant park-like feeling. In addition to the sets of row houses, other buildings were clearly intended as rental properties, especially those on the south side of West Clinton. The upper left shows a handful of large duplex buildings. Overall, the integrity of the nominated district is good, and one of the goals of the listing was to encourage property owners to take advantage of the tax credits. The district contains 83 contributing residential buildings representing a variety of period architecture, but a majority of the buildings are Queen Anne or one of its derivations. The large property on the lower left was built around 1890 for Charles Rapplegate, who was a foreman of a lumber company. To date, we have 3 letters of support for the historic district, one being from the Elmira Local Preservation Commission. Questions, comments?
I think we have a native of Elmira in the room. Would you like to say anything?
Not really, but I spent a lot of time. I grew up on the west side of the district, and St. Patrick's Church is on the east side of the district. So when I look at those buildings, I'm reminded of going to church. That was the group. So.
a happy memory, I hope.
Yes, absolutely.
When we were talking about it yesterday, Dan specifically noted that he remembered those row houses, so they are very distinctive in the district.
Jennifer, would you like to
Yes.
make the motion? Okay. And we have 2 seconds here. And Paul and Lucy, all in favor? Aye.
Next, we head north to Rochester and Monroe County for the first of 2 district nominations to be presented for sections of the 19th Ward in the city's southwest side. All these nominations these from the 19th Ward are sponsored by the 19th Ward Association with support from the Landmark Society of Western New York and the Preservation League of New York State. The Arvine Heights Historic District consists of one street that was part of the Arvine Park tract developed by Mrs. Lily Church Arvine in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. Of the 4 streets in the small tract, Arvine Heights has the most integrity, with all 37 houses contributing to the small district, many of them with contributing garages. The top image is a view from roughly midway looking east towards Genesee Valley Park. The lower image is an exceptionally fine colonial revival house on one of the larger lots, and this one at the west end of the district. Go to my next page here. The Rochester papers from this time period, that's the 1920s and 30s, continually reported on the active home building industry and often published decorating ideas and house plans, like the one seen in the upper left. Mrs. Arvine left the choice of house style to those who purchased lots on Arvine, but you can certainly see the influence the newspaper had on the choice of house style, with several of the residences here being similar to this English-type home. The street contains a number of examples of styles popular from the 1920s and early 1930s, such as 3 colonial revival homes pictured here, and an excellent example of a stucco-clad Tudor revival seen in the upper right. The district is being nominated under Criterion C for its collection of excellent architecture. Also well represented are Craftsman-style homes, and one of the last houses to be built on Arvine Heights was built in the 1950s, also in the colonial revival style, and is seen in the lower left. In addition to architecture, the district is being nominated for community planning and development under Criterion A for its association with the growth and development of the city and the history of Arvine Park. Any questions, comments?
Ron, will you move it? Okay. And Kristen, will you second? All in favor?
Aye.
West of Arvine Heights is the Inglewood Thurston Historic District, also being nominated under Criterion A and C for community planning and architecture. And again, this is part of the 19th Ward. The district was part of an early 20th century real estate and housing boom experienced by the city, and was originally part of the Boulevard Heights. Hard to say these things sometimes. The Boulevard Heights subdivision, developed by the Garfield Real Estate Company of Rochester. Like Arvine Heights, the nominated district was identified as retaining integrity to its period of development. Properties on the surrounding streets have high incidences of recent infill and remodeling and renovations of existing homes. But Inglewood and a small portion of Thurston have escaped the trend, with re-siding and replacement windows being the only incursions on the streets. The district has a collection of architecture popular to its period of significance, which is 1921 to 1927, with a large proportion being colonial revival buildings. Again, this was a period when house-style decorating kits were widely published in the local paper, which appears to have also made an impact with this period in the development of this ward. The district contains 141 resources, 77 of them being primary buildings, mostly residences. Among these residences are several fine examples of Craftsman Tudor revival and American four-square designs. And here's another view of Inglewood showing more of the architecture in the variations within the styles. As with Arvine, it was the lots that were sold when the Boulevard Heights developers featured model homes at the ends of the streets on Thurston Road. And speaking of Thurston Road, here we have a slide showing the upper, that is the north end of the nominated district. That would be the church that you see. Thurston is a main roadway through the area, and the portion in the nominated district that we have is mostly residential. And the other ends of Thurston are largely commercial. The upper image shows the former Lutheran church property with its modest collegiate and Gothic house of worship, and that kind of marks the north end of the east side of the street. At the other end, what we have is the Colonial Revival Presbyterian home. And then we have two other residences on Thurston, and I need to go back to consultants and ask if either of these were the model homes that were built by the developer. Any questions or comments about Boulevard or Inglewood, Thurston?
Jay makes the motion. Chuck seconds. All in favor?
Just so you know, there will be 2 more nominations coming in the next meeting for the 19th ward. So after that, you should be well versed with the 19th ward. And now for something completely different. The Liverpool Cemetery in the village of Liverpool in Onondaga County. For those not familiar with Liverpool, it's an incorporated village northwest of Syracuse that narrowly escaped being annexed to the city in the early 20th century. Due to its age and status as a still active burial ground, the cemetery is similar to other cemeteries established in the 19th century that reflect the trends of interment practices, in this case going from the late rural cemetery to the lawn park, and ending with just a touch of memorial park influences. As stated in the nomination, the 6 acres for the site were originally set aside in the early 19th century when the village was first surveyed, but the cemetery wasn't established until survey 1846. The cemetery is on land that has a flat portion on top of the hill that slopes to the east where it's flat. The hilltop portion was the first to be developed, with a section for burials reinterred from an older burial ground, and with the layouts of plots and surviving landscaping reflecting the late rural cemetery design idiom. This section of the cemetery also includes burials of influential families and individuals in Liverpool's history, such as the Gleasons pictured in the lower right. The patriarch of the family was Era Gleason, one of the village's early settlers, whose son Lucius went on to be a prominent lawyer and a wealthy banker. The cemetery is significant also under criterion consideration D for its age and association with Liverpool's history. It is also significant under criterion A in social history, especially in terms of immigration. As the cemetery slopes east, quite visible is a mixture of German names interspersed throughout, which become more prominent as you go further down the hill. The nomination text goes into the history of the German immigrants who settled in the village, first to work in canal-related industries, and later helped establish Liverpool's prominence in the willow basket trade. The sloping section of the cemetery also shows the transition to the lawn park design in cemeteries, with regular plot lines and limited landscaping allowing for the monuments to be more visible. The last trend in funerary practice seen in the cemetery, like I said, just a touch, is the memorial park philosophy of almost invisible single markers and large lawn spaces. And this tends to be in the immediate area around the Civil War Veterans Memorial marker from the 1920s, which is seen on the left. Actually, both of those give a sense of it. And finally, I could not end this presentation without showing you the only mausoleum built on the grounds, built for another of Liverpool's wealthy citizens, James O'Neill, who made his fortune in mining in the Midwest. His parents are buried in the upper end of the slope, the west end of the cemetery, and that's the upper left-hand image. And it's sort of, if you go out onto the portico part of the mausoleum, mausoleum and look towards the hill, you can sort of see where they are. But here we have it, the only mausoleum on the grounds, and it's the village that still owns and operates this particular cemetery, and the rules are no more mausoleums. So it's the Liverpool Village Cemetery. Any questions or comments?
Lucy, would you nominate? Okay. Paul, could you say? Great. All in favor?
Kathy, you want to do yours, or do you want Jenny to do yours?
Looks like my last, but I'm not, because remember we have Rock Bucket. And I also want to say that after all the visitors are certainly invited to stay for lunch, but don't leave without giving me your names for the minutes. No one sneaks out. Okay, this is the First Congregational Church of Walton. It's significant for its long and important association with the history of Walton and as a distinctive example of mid-19th century ecclesiastical architecture that was successively modified over the course of the century to reflect new ideas about Protestant church architecture and worship while retaining overall faithfulness to its original design. Walton is located southwest of Delhi, and it was settled in the 1780s. This is the third church built by this congregation, which was formed by the settlement families who came from Long Island and Connecticut. They were strict Calvinists, and the church that they built in 1840, which you see here, exemplified the Wren-Gibbs style, especially popular with New England Congregationalists. And there were no Congregationalists west of the Hudson, so they had to sign up here as Presbyterians. 20 years later, they enlarged this church by 16 feet to the rear and what appears to be an identical style. In 1881, the congregation responded to new directions in Protestant church worship that grew out of revivalism and called for comfortable interiors, clear sight lines, and rich decorations. Churches of this period also introduced Sunday school and community rooms. And to accommodate this church, and I didn't believe it until I saw the picture, the Walton Church was actually raised up 9 feet to create a basement. And you see it there. Records say they used cement, and I'm not sure exactly what they meant by saying they used cement. But in any case, they covered it with clapboard siding, and it also received an overlay of Victorian-era features, decorative lintels, stained glass, but within the original window openings, a new door, finials on the tower. They had, I don't have a side elevation, but large windows in the basement. Nothing was really removed. They just kind of added these Victorian features. And another postcard shows a pink and green color scheme on the exterior. The more important changes were on the interior, where they created an open plan so that everyone could see the minister, a large overhanging curved gallery, new and more comfortable pews, and wainscoting and stenciling, which I also have a picture of, but it didn't show up well enough. And most important, a platform pulpit. The latter brought the minister down to the congregation's level, allowing him to roam around and make eye contact, and also brought the choir to the front now that music assumed a more important place in the service. All this was in the service of making a space that was comfortable and conducive to worship. However, in the 1920s, the congregation needed additional room for activities, and so decided to remodel the church in accordance with its New England roots, adding the church house at the back, and also decided to remodel the church in accordance with its New England roots. At this point, they lowered the building again, about half the distance, and I can just see this church going up and down. They still use the basement, so we were figuring perhaps they dug some out. Can't quite understand it, but the windows on the basement are now half the size they were in the previous period. They painted everything white, and they added the Colonial Revival church house on the rear. Now, a few years later, in 1931, oh wait, this is the church house on the interior. And then a few years later, in 1931, they decided to add the projecting portico on the front, and that was the work of a well-known Binghamton architect whose name I forgot, but I have heard of him, which certainly reinforced the Gibbs part of the Wren Gibbs inspiration. So the Walton Church is a very interesting blend of three stylistic idioms, while still presenting an overall classical design. It retains features from each period and a very high level of integrity. So very interesting church here that went through many changes but retains a lot of integrity. Questions about the Walton Church? Very lovely group of people, by the way.
All right, Lucy nominates it. If there are no questions, do we have a second? Ron, would you second? Okay. All in favor?
Any of you architects have an idea of what they meant by a cement foundation in 1881? Randy, did you check that out with you?
It could have been. We dealt with an octagon house in 1856 that was mortar, basically cast with stones in it. So they couldn't get any kind of cement. 1881, actually, Portland was just available. Anybody got data on that?
1890 is the
Yeah,
evidence,
trickling in.
but it was trickling in
Yeah,
for
right.
a decade.
Anyway, it was lowering it down.
Last but not least, we're back to Westchester County for Walkabout. The draft for this was prepared by Phil Esser. He did a great job. So the Walkabout Historic District is significant under Criterion A in the areas of agriculture, community planning and development, and entertainment and recreation. The small agricultural hamlet of Walkabout and much of the surrounding land was owned and developed almost exclusively by the Meade family. The district, which encompasses 524 acres, includes the historic core of the Meade family's land holdings. And over a quarter of the land within the district is protected within land preserves. The district is also significant under Criterion C due to the wide variety of architectural styles exhibited throughout the community. Excellent examples of colonial, federal, Greek revival, Italian and Queen Anne, colonial revival, arts and crafts influence, Tudor revival, and even ranch-style buildings, in addition to a number of vernacular housing and some workers' housing, are all present. And from my visit there, it's absolutely like visiting a little architectural textbook. I'll show you the photographs as we move on here. Many of the buildings in the district were built by members of the Meade family and reflect the evolution of architectural styles over nearly 2 centuries of ownership. After Enoch Meade established a tavern and farm along the Post Road during the late 18th century, other members of the family began to settle nearby. Later generations established successful agricultural operations, or inns, in the region, while others made their fortunes in law or real estate. Martin and Erastus Meade built the hamlet's first large inn, the Walkabout House, to cater to the growing tourist market after the railroad was completed to nearby Pilgrim Falls. George Washington Meade left his father's farm in Walkabout to become a successful lawyer in New York City. He returned by 1870, built a large gentleman's farm, and instilled a love of his family's land in his children. By the early 20th century, George's children began to focus on how to profit from the family land without changing its character. Some continued the family's farming operations, which focused on dairying, livestock, and poultry. In 1912, they renovated the 1878 farmhouse from the Indian Spring Gentleman's Farm into the Walkabout Inn and built a professionally designed golf course. In addition, they established a cottage rental industry within the hamlet and developed family land away from the hamlet on Meade Street. George's 11 children were primarily responsible for either renovating existing farmhouses or building new houses along Meade Street around the turn of the 20th century. And these range from more modest to high-style examples of residential architecture throughout. This is the Walkabout Post Office, which is still active. I had to show it to you because it's so adorable. It was built in 1880 by Robert Poe, the owner of the Indian Spring Gentleman's Farm. And this is the Meade Memorial Chapel. After George Washington Meade died in 1899, his widow contracted Hobart Upjohn to design this memorial chapel in his honor. And it's already individually listed on the National Register. Facing pressure from sources both within and outside the family, the Meade siblings began exploring development plans for the family land during the early to mid-20th century. They commissioned reports, designs, and landscape plans, but they really couldn't agree on what they wanted done with the land. So there's sort of a start and stop period of lack of development in the community, which is pretty notable in Westchester County at that time. They wanted to retain the feel of the place despite all economic pressures and had strict protocols for new construction. And so what you get in the upper left-hand corner is one of the plans they had for a specific housing type they wanted to build. There's nothing exactly like that, but there are a couple homes kind of similar that ended up getting built within the district. And we have some Tudor revival and colonial revival, sort of arts and craftsy things going on. The Meade family restricted land ownership on Meade Street to family members through the mid-20th century, developed a zoning plan, and eventually established the Long Pond Preserve. As a result of the family's strict oversight and careful management, particularly in the face of 20th century development pressures, the landscape and architecture within the hamlet of Wacabuck retains a high level of integrity and continues to illustrate its layered history. We have a letter of support from the Lewisboro Town Board and from the Lewisboro historian. And we have a visitor today on behalf of the district, Melissa DiVincenzo. She's a member of the Wacabuck Landowners Council, and she's coordinated the effort to list the district. And if you'd like to say any words.
Right, quickly, thank you for the opportunity to present this submission, and Jennifer for all your help in doing so. Bill Reese really helped guide us. Our intention was to really share with everyone and acknowledge the historic area of Wacabuck. It is a very unique and hidden charm for us, and we work very hard as a community to maintain the natural integrity and history associated with our little hamlet. So our beautification committee works to make sure that the original character of the landscape is continually maintained with birthday celebrations and ongoing plantings and maintenance of the community as a whole. Our tree committee is dedicated to just making sure that any old trees are removed but then quickly replaced with new trees. We even have a sign committee to make sure that that is in alignment with the character of our hamlet. Chapel committee oversees that the chapel continues to be active and used within our community. And Christmas Eve we hold a choir that is hosted by the children of our community. So they sing Christmas songs there. So we're a very active community, and everyone who lives there will all agree that we come there because of the beauty and history associated with Wacabuck. So I am here really on behalf of Susan Henry, who still resides in Wacabuck and is a Meade family descendant. And it's because of her that Wacabuck has maintained the character that it has now from its long-standing history. So thank you again for the opportunity to present our proposal, and hope you support it as well.
Such talent, Motley Schmidt and Harry G. Lindenberg and Levitt, wow, all in one place. Who will move it? Kristen will move it, and Michael will second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
I believe that's it.
I think we are.
Unless the members have anything else they want to bring up. Anyone have any business they want to bring up?
If not, do we have a motion to?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to report that I guess it was announced earlier, I was a little late because my wife is being admitted to practice before the federal courts in this judicial district. And I look forward to a time when she will perhaps move from defense to prosecution and prosecute anyone who violates the National Historic Preservation Act in this part of the state.
Special hotline right from here to her office.
Okay, I think Gwen has made the motion to adjourn. We have a second, okay.
Who was the second?
Okay, all in favor?